Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, Mr. Elliott. Thank you so much for coming to the first art symposium organized by the Hong Kong Art Gallery Association. Let me just introduce myself. I'm Henrietta, Katie, and we are the co-chairs of the association. Just want to talk a little bit about the association. Founded in 2012 by a group of local and international galleries. About 50 of us came together and decided that we needed an association in Hong Kong. And the purpose of this was is to provide an open platform for everybody who loves the art, who is in art, and who wants to be in art to come together and to become a unity and a uniform voice. We also wanted to reach out to everybody who is interested in art and also to entertain and to some extent educate the public of Hong Kong. After we started, we decided that we wanted to come together and create a series of events. So we have created this Hong Kong Art Week for the 4th year, and we're delighted to see that all of you are here for this inaugural event, the Art Symposium, under the Hong Kong Art Week. That's happening now. First of all, I would like to thank our sponsors, especially the Bank of China Hong Kong Private Banking, for supporting us all along since our edition 1, and Art Development Council being our supporter, as we are one of the grantees as well. And just to conclude, we want to throw out this question: why does art matter? This 2 days, we will be investigating, we'll be hearing from experts. We'd like to hear from you what you think, how you think about how art matters. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker.
So it's a great pleasure to see you all here today. I understand that there was a little bit of difficulty on the ticket platform and as well as the Asia Society website. So thank you for pushing through and getting here. We have a whole lot of events this week. So I hope you have a chance to check out the website. This 2 days of talks are really something very special for Hong Kong to have such a wonderful roster of speakers. As well, I'd like you to notice the table in the back, which says the Gallery Walk for Charity, where you can buy tickets for Thursday night's art festival. And I hope you all come to that. I'm happy to introduce my friend and longtime friend of Hong Kong, David Elliott. David is a British curator, writer, and professor of modern and contemporary art who has directed museums in Oxford, Stockholm, Tokyo, and Istanbul. He is currently chairman of the board of Triangle Art New Work Gasworks in London, chairman of the advisory board of Momentum in Berlin, and a visiting professor in curatorship at the Chinese University in Hong Kong. His new book, Art and Trousers, Tradition and Modernity in Contemporary Asian Art, will be published next year, and we're all looking forward to that. David?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Hong Kong Art Gallery Association, for inviting me to this, and thank you also for coming along today. You're going to be faced now by a blitzkrieg of images, and, well, we're on time, more or less, so that's good. Now try and make sure we keep on time. Now just make sure that I press the right one. Yeah. So the title of this talk is Alterity and Other Things, Thinking About Qualities in Contemporary Art. And in this, I take myself as some kind of study topic, because I'm going to talk about why I'm interested in contemporary art, why I think it's worth spending time with, and why in fact I think it's not a complete waste of time. And basically, if you work with it, if you run a gallery or if you're a curator, and if you can't answer this question very, very clearly, every day you get up, you perhaps ought not to be working with art. What is it that makes art so appealing, so different to other things? But let's start talking about qualities. Il buono, il brutto, il cattivo, the good, the ugly, and the bad. Or, there he is, il cattivo. The good, the bad, the ugly. Now, are these different groups of people, are they really good, bad, and ugly? And what has this got to do with art? Because maybe art can be good, bad, and ugly all at the same time. And in the end of the day, the most important thing, in spite of perhaps its ugliness, in spite of its badness, is it really any good? And that is the start, the beginning of a question about aesthetics. And aesthetics is about the world. It's about the social world, it's about the cultural world, and it's about the political world. And artists, bring these things together in different ways. They bring them together in different ways that are disinterested. Now, this idea of being disinterested is very important. I'm not talking about being uninterested. I'm meaning the artist is disinterested. Their only interest is in making the work as good as it possibly can be as art. Not as a market force, not as sociology, not as politics, but as art. The artist is part of life, they're of life, what they do runs parallel to life. But essentially, they're disinterested in life, other than in art itself. This is what got me involved in art. It's an exhibition that took place in Munich long before I was born in 1938, and it's of degenerate, inverted commas, art. It's organized by the Nazis, all the art they hated. And there's Dear Adolf at the opening. And you see there's the words behind. It says, written by George Gross, a wonderful artist. You should take Dada really seriously. It's really worth it. And what are Hitler and his friends doing? They're making fun of it. They're saying this is degenerate. This is decadent. This is bad as being Jewish or Bolshevik. It's all the same thing. This is trash. Well, I was lucky. I was able to see some of this. And I just thought, well, if this is trash, it's the kind of trash I'd like to devote my life to. Now, interestingly, that's the queue outside the exhibition of degenerate art in Munich in 1938. And it had over 2 million visitors. People are queuing to see it, maybe to get a good laugh. We don't really know. There weren't many visitor surveys at that time. But certainly we do know that when Hitler showed the work that he was really interested in, the great German, pure, non-degenerate art exhibition in 1941, there was only a small fragment of that number of people, maybe 30,000 or 40,000 people. So, 1970, 71, time I made my first exhibition. Now, at that time, I was a student and undergraduate in history in the University of Durham. And instead of being in front of the American Embassy in Grosvenor Square, trying to throw billiard balls under police horses' hooves, like I probably should have been, I decided that I'd look at Germany in the early years of the 20th century. Because, of course, what people were protesting against in Grosvenor Square was the war in Vietnam, particularly the American involvement in it. So I thought, yes, I'm certainly against that. But fascism isn't a new thing. This kind of rapacious, voracious colonialism is not a new thing. It goes back. And it made an echo for me because as a child, the museum near where I'd been brought up in Leicester had acquired many German art, works of German art from émigrés, from people who've been forced to fly from Hitler, mainly because they were Jewish. This is one of the works. An artist, Carl Ludwig Elias, at the age of 7¼ He made that in 1899. Or this work by Ernst Barlach. Now, Barlach wasn't Jewish. This work was made in 1914. It's called The Avenger. And it was made when war broke out with Britain. And it's a nationalistic work on behalf of the Germans. But still, it was regarded as degenerate by Hitler, in spite of its nationalism. Not just because of its style, because of what it represented. And that was this disinterestedness that I mentioned before. Another word for it is autonomy. Autonomy, artists who look at the world for themselves in the truthfulest possible way and try to make some sense of it. Or this work by Ludwig Meidner, made in 1912, strangely prophetic of the Holocaust to come in 1914, Apocalyptic Vision. Or this, a little later, made in the middle of the First World War by George Gross, who Hitler liked so much. Just a cafe scene. So these artists and filmmakers, scenes from Dr. Caligari, were showing the world as they saw it. They were showing a fractured world, a world falling apart, in some cases even before it did fall apart in the First World War. In my reading of a very important book by Sigrid Krakauer at that time, called From Caligari to Hitler, A History of the German Film, I must say was a great influence. If you haven't read it, it's one of the most informative books about film history, about psychology you could ever wish to read. Same time, 1970, and I just graduated from Durham University, I went down to London with my mother to see this exhibition, Art and Revolution, at Hayward Gallery. Now, this was the first time ever that anyone had put together a show of really Russian revolutionary art, the constructivists, the suprematists, the different things that happened at that time. It's an amazing time. And the Hayward had worked with the Russian government to put this together. And for me, it was a complete revelation. Now, until 1963, when Camilla Gray wrote The Great Experiment in Russian Art, we knew very little about what had gone on there. It was all rather secondhand from Russian emigres, people from the USSR who had been forced to emigrate because of their political beliefs. And it was all a little bit one-sided. And here, in this exhibition, it was first of many, many that took place all over the world. It was possible just to get a flavor of quite what was happening. So in 1976, I get offered a job in Oxford as director of the Museum of Modern Art there. And I wasn't very old. I was 26 when I was offered it. And I did realize I didn't know very much about art. But I did know what was being talked about and what was popular at that time. This is Donald Judd. It's one of the first shows of drawings that I made when I was there. And what interested me about Judd was not only the kind of machine-madeness of his work, but also his relationship and obvious interest in Russian constructivism. And this is at the very time, this wonderful book by Lucy Lippard called 6 Years, The Dematerialization of the Art Object from 1966 to 1972, really spells out what was happening in contemporary art at that time. Of course, I'm talking about the West. Because at this time in the early 70s, contemporary art was only the art of the West, being Western Europe and North America. Nowhere else got a look in. No one else took it seriously. Now, this seems absolutely crazy, but I'm afraid it was the truth. So this dematerialization, this process of dematerialization, it was obvious at that time that things were falling apart. And one of these very early exhibitions that I made, in fact, it was 3 exhibitions all at the same time, was Frank Stella, the first of these groups of works that he started in 1976. He was a minimalist, and he obviously felt he had to step out of this straitjacket. So these are far from minimalist works. They're made out of cut aluminium. They're huge reliefs. stole the wit, was a conceptual artist, and a very minimal conceptual artist at that, his incomplete open cubes. So I was in a building which had 3 floors. So Stella on the top, the wit in the middle, and on the bottom, the smaller space, Hans Hofmann's. His works on paper and board from the very early 40s, where he's making drip paintings. Now, these are really before people started talking about drip paintings, and Hofmann was taught by Wassily Kandinsky in Munich. He's the link, if you like, between German early avant-garde, the Blauer Reiter group, and the American Expressionists. And it's a very, very important link. And it's one that we flagged up in this exhibition. And what went on at the same time was another example of one of these other things. Was it good? Was it bad? Was it ugly? Or was it just other? This alterity. A small show and publication, a performance by Rose English, Sally Potter, and Jackie Lansley called Mounting. And it was really set in the Frank Stella exhibition. So there on the, there's one of the works. It's in the opening of the Stella. Here are the 3 girls plotting what they're going to do. And they take on these kind of macho Western Clint Eastwood personalities to talk about the work and maleness. And Rose English did what she still does sometimes. She put on her horse costume with these hooves and very elegantly trotted across the gallery. But what was also very clear at that time was that women were almost as excluded as were artists who didn't happen to live and work in Western Europe and North America. So there was another alterity. In fact, women had been as heavily colonized as had the non-West by men. Oops, let's get the right one. Now, just to quickly show, Jo Bayer, female artist, one of the minimalists, in fact, one of the very few female womanist artists. There was another exhibition shown at that time. Or Mary Kelly, famously known at that time as an artist who worked with her own baby's nappies. She's working with the baby grows there, but doing an analysis of motherhood. These things were absolute scandal when they took place at that time. And going back to the idea of what was happening in Russia, El Lissitzky, who was one of the leading characters there, the chance of showing some of his work in a detailed way to a British public. There hadn't been a proper El Lissitzky show there before. And Lissitzky really thinking about space stations floating in deep, deep cosmos. This is what he wrote about these works. 1978. And to think about art, you sometimes have to think about things that are not art, but related to it, would have a visuality or a kind of spiritual quality or material quality, which is like that of art. So an exhibition about work of people who are in psychiatric hospitals. So they're not there as artists, but they were there sometimes mediated by their therapists, sometimes not mediated at all, but really very remarkable things. And one of the works in that exhibition was painted by the ballet dancer, Václav Nijinsky. It was from the collection, Goodman-Mackay collection, which is in the Maudsley Hospital, one of the chief psychiatric hospitals in London. And as you can see from this obsessive drawing, it would be called Art Brut, perhaps, but never shown as such, and certainly not regarded by Nijinsky as such, of his master and Svengali, Sergei Diaghilev, the ballet master who sent him mad. Or something else which wasn't quite art, but had a lot to do with design and art, the falling leaf, aerial drop propaganda, a history of things that have been thrown out of aeroplanes onto other people to try and make them, either demoralize them or try and persuade them to change hands, change sides. This was dropped by the Germans over the Maginot Line at the beginning of the World War II onto the French. And it's really saying that, look, boys, you are going to fall like the leaves in autumn, this autumn. You should realize you just give up on the British. You don't have any sense going with them. And beware. You can see there's a skull with a French helmet on at the bottom of that. Or this, even more crude. anti-British, anti-Semitic jigsaw puzzle dropped by the British on the French troops. So the blonde woman holding the Times sees a darker-looking lady holding the Semite newspaper. Nasty stuff. Or this, I mean, I won't say typically British, but dropped by the British on Burmese, Japanese troops in Burma in 1942, and there's a haiku, the fluttering of cherry petals, and then comes the storm. Oh, it took, unfortunately, another 3 years before the storm came. The sentiment was there. Or this dropped by the Americans over Tokyo and other big cities in Japan right in the closing years of the war when the carpet bombing was taking place, saying, danger, military establishments, danger factories, so keep out the way of these places. Not that that would have done any good. So looking at mechanisms of persuasion and advertising also seemed to be very important in thinking about what is art and what is not art, and actually about how things influence you or don't influence you. This is a series of works that was made in Oxford by Hans Harker as part of a big exhibition we made together. It's now in the Tate Gallery. It's 7 panels, and it's called A Breed Apart. And it's made about the involvement of British Leyland, which is an Oxford-based car production firm at that time, the involvement of British Leyland in sanction breaking and illegal activities in South Africa. Now, the title is taken from the advertisements for British Leyland South Africa that they gave for their new model of the Jaguar. And it was for the person who was, can you believe it, a breed apart. So that became the title of all the 7 panels. And the other Leyland Vehicles logo, which you see at the bottom there, was Leyland Vehicles, nothing can stop us now. So the piece is basically made up of photographs taken from Leyland advertising and advertising copy, then photographs of Leyland vehicles, particularly Land Rovers, put to paramilitary use in South Africa. And very typical of Hans Harker's work, it has that strongly social element. And it was very exciting and quite nerve-wracking to put that together. But when I say that art is intrinsically involved with ideas of quality, ethical quality, truth, quality of life, quality of culture, quality of society, and quality of politics, I really mean it. And I thought this when I was 26, and I still think it today. So 79, we hop. A large show of Alexander Rodchenko, one of the leading Russian constructivists. Really the first time anyone had managed to put together the whole range of his work. The reason for that was in Russia, the USSR, Rodchenko was a persona non grata that wasn't seen in the art museums. They wouldn't show it. They preferred official art. But I got in touch with his family in Moscow. His family had lots and lots of his work, and they were kind enough to lend work to me for that. Now, in theory, you weren't supposed to be able to borrow from private collections in the USSR because private collections didn't exist. But of course they existed. All artists' families had lots of stuff. And with a bit of negotiation, it was possible to borrow work from the family and also from other collections all over the world. So for the first time, Rodchenko as an artist, as a graphic artist, as a designer, as a painter, was seen. And as a photographer. This is Lily Brick, one of his close friends, and as you can see, they had a lot of fun as well. And that's who she had fun with, mostly. Vladimir Mayakovsky, that is also a photograph by Rodchenko, a poet, propagandist. So he did cross over a line between art and propaganda or advertising in quite an interesting way. And this is a work made towards the end of his life by Alexander Rodchenko, a painting, 1943 to 44. It's not very constructivist, is it? It looks a bit sort of drippy. Yet like the paintings of Hans Hofmann, which were drippy, that he was making in the early 40s in New York, this was being made in Moscow, in wartime Moscow. And one thing leads to another. The exhibition that followed on from that was of Jackson Pollock. And as a young curator, trying to think what was important and what did I think was good, and not just hold myself in the present, in this dematerializing art world, which Lucy Lippard talked about, but look to the recent past. Pollock was someone in the 70s who no one was taking much notice of in Britain. We made this show together with the Museum of Modern Art in New York, drawing into painting, really examining how he used drawing as a means of making these mega paintings. And then, from Pollock to José Clemente Orozco. How on earth does that go? What on earth was I thinking of? I mean, what kind of coherent program is being made here? He's in Russia at the moment, like going 50 years back in Russia. He's doing Don Judd at the next moment, then these ladies who were taking the piss out of Frank Stella, and next time he's doing a muralist in Mexico. My God. There's method in the madness, though, as well as revolution. It's an amazing sequence of murals that Orozco made in Mexico City about the Mexican Revolution, in which he participated, and about which he was extremely cynical and not at all laudatory. He thought the revolution was the toughest and the most cruelest of times, and that as a building block for his nation, it was not anything he was very proud of. This is a Pizarro and Malinche, the colonist and the Indian, the indigenous person joined together. The false leaders, the people who in the late 19th century and after that, including during the revolution, had stabbed the people in the back. The sad revolutionaries, the soldados and the soldaderas, just constantly on the move, having to move from one battle to the other. The Mexican Revolution continued from about 1910 to about 1917. And perhaps the most prescient, the scrap heap of ideologies. This is part of the preparatory school murals made in 1923, 1925. And what do you see? You see swastika, 1923, 1925. You see the French Phrygian cap of the Revolution. You see the Italian fasces. You see the history of Europe for the next 20 years in this mural. He worked in New York as well, very fascinated by the effects of colonialism. And then in the end of the 30s, 36 to 38 in Guadalajara, he returns to this topic, the battle of ideologies, as it was playing out, beginning to dramatically play out in Europe and in Asia. And then perhaps his greatest work is called The Man of Fire. It's in the Hospicio, thank you, in Guadalajara, and it's part of a whole cycle of murals. And this work, and in fact all of Orozco's work, deeply influenced the young Jackson Pollock, and actually helped Pollock to get his head round to the state whereby he'd start to make his drip paintings. But at the beginning of the 80s, something else happened. In the wider world, the word wider than the art world, which was still decompressing. It's typified by this exhibition, A New Spirit in Painting, which took place in the Royal Academy of Arts in London in 1981. And in this process of dematerializing, conceptualization, or minimalization of art, there'd been a lot of grumbling and talking in the back rooms of galleries about, oh God, we really need something that people want to buy. And I remember Nicholas Logsdale at Listen Gallery took me aside in 1978 and said, I think the next thing is going to be painting. Well, yes, good. And sure enough, it was. And it was also accompanied by the liberalization of the markets, first in America and then in Britain. And this had a huge effect because lots of spare money was sloshing around, and a lot of it was spent on art. And art also became an amazing vehicle for money laundering at this time. So what the effect that this had is the price of contemporary art, which previously had been relatively low, just rocketed. And it was much friendlier, maybe, to collectors and to an audience. It was historic. It was made of oil paint and things, traditional materials. And this led to a complete sea change in how contemporary art was regarded and practiced. Because the first time, I mean, Picasso didn't set out to make a lot of money from his painting. Henry Moore only started to make money after the age of 40. And that was, he didn't set out to do that. It was only then that people started to take an interest. And Picasso and Henry Moore are people who were right at the top of the field. So there was a bohemia, there was an avant-garde, and this had an alternative, peripheral life. And what's happened by this time is there's no bohemia, there's no avant-garde, there's art business. And that is a huge change. Well, we continued looking at various characters. There's Mayakovsky again, an exhibition called 20 Years of Work, which was a reconstruction of an exhibition he himself made in 1930, about 3 or 4 months before he committed suicide. And he realized, because he was being very heavily criticized in the Soviet press at that time, that the dream he had had about a new society was not possible. And that and a sad love affair led to him to commit suicide. But before then, at the beginning of the 20s, he and Rodchenko were working together as an advertising company. There was still a mixed economy between state interests and private interests, and they decided they'd work for the main state department store, and this is called Mosoprom. Kupi v Gumie, that's in Gum, and he make up a little jingle here. Nigde kromie kak v Moselpromie. Nowhere else but in Mosselprom will you find these things. Or, the only thing that remains from the old world is era cigarettes. You should buy them. And of course, these rhyme in Russian. You can almost sing them. And together, I mean, the beginning of advertising, commercial advertising in this modern way, can be seen, a very significant element here in the work of Rodchenko and Mayakovsky in the USSR, working for the state. And there's the Mosselprom department store. Раскупай by Vostochi Lyud, Luchi Galosh, Riviez Verlyud. So please buy them, people of the East. Better galoshes you'll never find. So trying to sell galoshes to people in deserts. Resinotrest, the state rubber industry. And there's Lily, she's got her pants on this time. And Mayakovsky, as well as being an advertising artist, a propagandist poet, was also a great love poet, a lyric poet. And this is called Proeto, about this. About this was his love affair with Lily Brick, and Rodchenko did the illustrations for that. And he did propaganda posters at the time of the war, the Civil War. And that is him at his final exhibition, where he's showing the people that he's done, that he's been honest, he's shown the revolution just before he commits suicide. 20 years of work. So thinking about other things, thinking about a hidden history behind the Iron Curtain that still existed at that time, there were other curtains, and one of them was Asian art. And in 1981, I started to get involved with Asian art with a series of exhibitions about India. And these cover 3 areas. One is folk art, photography, and then modern art, modernity. I really wanted to look at folk art and take that seriously because it was so energetic, so attractive. There were so many different elements in it. Whereas the modern art, as you'll see, is rather existentialist. It's rather anguished. And I was just wondering really why there was this big chasm between so-called popular arts and fine art. Well, we took as a study the wayside shrines of Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan, and working with Komal Kothari, who was a leading specialist in that field. We showed some of the paintings and objects which were made there. The other India was a view of 7 contemporary photographers. This is Nagarajan, who's looking at the decaying mansions in southern India. Or Pablo Bartholomew. Of course, a lot of Westerners came through India at that time. You can see one there. And terrible contrasts of poverty and richness, which still exist. So in the myth and reality was looking at modernity, the start of modernity, when we dated that around about World War II, the start of the Bombay Progressives. You can go back a little further, but we started with the Bombay Progressives and came up to what was then the present. This is K.G. Subramanian, a terracotta work that he made at the time of the war with Bangladesh in 1970-71, with terrible slaughter and misplacement of refugees into Calcutta. So great suffering at that time. Tiyab Mehta, this is a Trust Bull of 1956. Obviously Picasso-esque, but I think a very beautiful and a very well-stated expression of India at that time, in the time after partition, when it was independent, but trying in the process of becoming something. M.F. Hussain, one of the masters artists of these early Bombay Progressives. In fact, a Muslim artist who was forced to leave and spend his last days in Dubai because works like this were judged by members of the BJNP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which are now in power in India, as blasphemous because they show Hindu gods in a bad way and he's Muslim. Or Francis Newton Sousa, great, great artist anywhere, came from Goa. Goa was colonized by the Portuguese, and so there's this strong Christian element in the work. Or Bikash Bhattacharjee lived in Calcutta. You saw the drug addict Westerner, and here are the hippies on their way through, seen through the perspective of Calcuttan eyes. And there's M.F. Hussain in the museum, and one day he came and would say, I'll do a painting. People want to look at me doing it, it's perfectly okay. It's a demonstration, it'll be educational for them. And there he's working on the floor of the gallery, and just people were trotting in and out. And this is the top gallery there, and it's kind of interesting because there's a young Anish Kapoor there in the front, and to his credit, he decided he was an Indian artist. He was told by his dealer, again, Nicholas Logsdale, that he really shouldn't be in with this bunch of losers. You know, these people, you know, they're not really modern art. And he did. He was in there, and he was really one of the youngest, and put together with Mrinalini Mukherjee, who sadly just passed away a year ago. Who was a woman artist working in hemp, and together they made a very strong statement about traditional forms in Indian art, in contemporary or modern Indian art. And so the Russian thing continues. Bet you didn't know the beautiful painted porcelains were made in the USSR. And this was made at the time of the Volga famine, when America was sending huge amounts of grain to Russia as well. They were very strong allies. Well, these textile designs from 1927, this is called drums. So slightly martial, but you see the drum beats being, the sound of them factored into the design. Or aviation, Soviet aviation on the top, and then on the bottom you've got this wonderful printed textile of Red Army men picking cotton, no doubt in Uzbekistan. And then really wild stuff, and this just happens to be made, it's airbrush painting on satin, on velvet satin, by Lyudmila Mayakovskaya, who is like Mayakovsky's older sister. That's just a fluke of history, but she's a very great textile artist in her own right. Now, in the new spirit in painting, German art, Western German art, really came up and being considered very, very seriously by the art world, whereas previously it had been more or less excluded. And as a curator, trying to sort things out, I was just wondering, what's going on here? I mean, George Baselitz, who I think is a very good painter, he was making work in 1960, and none of us were taking any notice of it whatsoever. Why weren't we? If it was good in 1960, why weren't we seeing it? What made us not see his goodness until it became popular to be into painting again, and this new historical approach and a kind of promotion, Cold War art promotion took place. So I popped my head behind the Berlin Wall and had a look at what was happening in the GDR. And rather interestingly, in the Bundesrepublik, in the Western Germany, there had been this big break in German art history, because the official line was that, well, even the expressionists were compromised by Nazism. We have to stop being Germans. We have to be international. And so there was a lot of drip painting and American-type painting going on there. Whereas in the Eastern Germany, they continued with expressionism. They said, basically, we were communist all the way along. We never supported Hitler. And this is the kind of art we made in the 20s and 30s, and we'll continue making it now. Thank you very much. So it's a very interesting dialectic, a very interesting alterity there, which somehow didn't come out in the wash too well back in the 1980s. This is Werner Tübke, kind of magical realist artist. Gudrun Rune, with two, she's in the middle, and there's Paula Modersohn-Becker and Rosa Luxemburg. Well, Modersohn-Becker being an artist, Rosa Luxemburg a politician. Or Hubertus Gieber, one of the young lions, the young Turks of GDR art. And this isn't, it's not party-led, it's not party subjects, it's very individual work, the kind of stuff that was being done anywhere. Or Jörg Immendorf, working on the West, who was making a series of Café Deutschland paintings. And it was an imaginary space that he conjured together along the Berlin Wall, that there was a Café Deutschland in the dead man's land between the two walls of East and West, where intellectuals could meet and get together. And so he made a whole series of paintings about this, about German modern history. Now, at that time in the Royal Academy, there was an exhibition called German Art in the 20th Century. And this is the first large exhibition of German art to take place in Britain since the end of World War II. So it's a very, very significant exhibition. There were some wonderful artworks in it, but the punchline in it basically was that the life was in this new generation of artists from West, in fact, who weren't that new, had been working since the 1960s, but we hadn't looked at them, that this is where the scene was in German art. And so it was very much weighed towards validating the contemporary art. Now, there was nothing from the German Democratic Republic in this exhibition, and work by only 3 women artists, which is a travesty if one looks at the history of that time. And I'm just wondering, what were we doing in the middle of the 1980s of doing a Cold War exhibition about Europe instead of looking at German history, if German history was what we were really interested in? Looking at the USSR, of course, there are many dissenting voices, both by Russians inside and outside Russia. Komar and Melanid were important ones. This is called 30 Years Ago. 30 years ago, 1953, the day of the death of Stalin. Now, the cliche is that everyone broke down and cried. Well, he's showing a young couple there who are virtually entangling themselves in desire at the death of Stalin. Whoops, that's dropped. I don't know where it's gone. Or Stodelet, what is to be done? Another fake, false socialist realist painting. So it's adopting the style of Stalinism, but subverting it by adopting its style. Jumping back into Asia, we started to look at a completely unknown art history. In fact, a period which the Japanese themselves did not take so very seriously, 1945 to 1965. And I was helped by this by a young researcher in the University of Oxford who was Japanese. And it was really looking at the period from the end of the war until the middle of the 60s and what happened here. And it was an amazing period of creativity. Obviously, it starts off with subjects from the war. Fukuzawa was not he was a soldier, but then he refused to fight, so he was not a militarist at all. So there were reactions to the war. There were reactions to the pushing of peasant freeholders off their land. This is a kind of surrealistic work made by Yamashita Kikuji. There was reactions to the American occupation. This is made by Onkowara when he was still living in Japan. It's called Black Soldier. As you can see, it's a view from underneath. And this shaped canvas is made in 1955. Incredibly advanced work. Or the Neo-Dada organizers, these performances out in the street. At the same time, in 1985, it was the 40th anniversary of the dropping of the H-bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so we decided that we'd show things which weren't art, but made images produced by survivors of the Hiroshima blast, and what they remembered. Hopping around again, back to India, Rabindranath Tagore. And obviously there are other things that are happening in the middle of all of this. A mainstream exhibition of Western European and British art. But this is the pepper, if you like, that we're putting in with the meat and potatoes. And Eisenstein, the Alterity that I was talking about, very famous film director, who also was a very good and talented draftsman and theater director. And there he is in his first film he called Mudrets, Enough Simplicity for Every Wise Man. Not what you think of as necessarily Eisenstein. This, Battleship Potemkin, of course, on the Odessa steppes. And Eisenstein in Hollywood. Who knew he went to Hollywood? He wrote back home on when he sent this, it's a Proust-tinted photograph, he sent it back to Russia, and he said, Red Dog meets Hollywood film star. Well, of course, the Hollywood film star is Rin Tin Tin. And again, rather wistfully, writing back from Hollywood, to my best friend in the USSR, together with my best friend in the USA, who's a cardboard cutout of Mickey Mouse. He moved down to Mexico, where he made the best film never made. There's miles of footage which is never edited by him. And then the last film that he made, Ivan the Terrible, parts 1 and 2, in which you can see very, very clearly how strongly Eisenstein was influenced by Japanese prints and kabuki theater. And some say by his experience of being in the Cambridge College, particularly in this scene, this banqueting scene. He said that it reminded him of having formal dinner in Cambridge. This silhouette is often likened to a Hokusai woodblock print. And then the moving around, the shadow, very suggestive of German expressionist film, but also of Asian dramatic theater as well. And the tragic story of his cousin who tries to take over his throne. And then it bursts into color. They got, I think, a reel of color Agfa film captured from the Germans, and they started to use it because in second part of Ivan, they were shooting it in Kazakhstan, where he'd been, where he'd been evacuated. So, if there's good art being made in Asia, which we didn't really know about, what about Africa? Of course. You just have to take the trouble to look for it. And there's a terminological problem that we've had here, because when we're talking about modern art, modernity always, it's the language of the victor, really. If you happen to live in many countries in Africa, modernity meant being colonized. It didn't mean much else. It could mean, okay, progress of a way, but it was all second-hand progress through the strain, of the people who were running you. But contemporary, when we started to use the word contemporary art more widely at the beginning of the 90s, this was a much freer word. It was a word without any political loading to it. I mean, contemporary just means now. Anything that is made is now. It doesn't mean that it's any good. If you said that something was modern art, it implied that, well, it was in a range of activity of something that was interest, if it was modern art, if it was lucky enough to get in there. So if contemporary art can be, anything can be contemporary art, then the question is a very different question, is why should I spend time looking at it? And the only way to answer that is if you think it's any good. And we're back to goodness and badness and ugliness. Now, some of these works made by the Mokonde people in Tanzania and northern Mozambique are very satirical. This elephant Shetani. A Shetani is a spirit, or comes from the English word Satan through Arabic and Swahili. Or this, a social work coming out of northern Mozambique, which is a communist country, a tree of life, Ujama, a kind of tree of solidarity of people coming together. Kusama fitted into this story as well, as did art from South Africa. Now, all we had from South Africa was, as you saw in the Hans Harker work, was apartheid. But once we started to look and to get researchers out, we realized there was a whole lot of activity going there. But there was one big problem. The ANC in exile had a cultural boycott. It said you should not support art from South Africa at all until the apartheid regime is gone. So we started to talk with the ANC and say, look, why don't we, things are changing. This was at the end of the 80s. Things have got to change. Why don't we work with you to make an exhibition of the new South African art? And some of it included even a character like this, made by Johannes Masangani, a black sculptor, showing Pete Botha. Now, is it satirical or is it not? It's hard to say. Under the context of apartheid, when it was made, I think almost certainly it is. Or the young William Kentridge, the first time he ever showed his films was in this exhibition. And a whole range of other artists. I think there were about 150, 200 artists involved in this show, which eventually came to the UK in that the ANC said, yes, it can be part of this festival that we do. And while we're making it, the ANC was unbanned, and then 2 years later, Mandela was freed. Photography in Russia. Because what's been happening in Russia, of course, by 1990, is that perestroika and the country is beginning to break up. It hasn't quite broken up totally, but it's beginning to break up. And so it was possible to get hold of archives, state archives, in a way that hadn't been possible before. So we're able to show a range of historical photography and really make this available publicly for the first time. Even color photography, that's from about 1912. It's an autotype process, so it's a negative on glass by the author Leonid Andreev. Pasternak. His two sisters lived in Oxford. And of course, what had happened at the end of the 30s, the purges and the effect that the purges had. Mayakovsky, you could say, well, had the foresight, I wouldn't say the sense, had the foresight to commit suicide. Meyerhold, his close associate in theater, was murdered in 1940, and that is the last photograph taken of him. But as the USSR crumbled in 1992, it was possible for us to look seriously at the official art of Russia, which I wouldn't have done before. And so a small exhibition was made of Soviet Socialist Realism. This is a work by Konstantin Maximov, who in 1954-55 traveled to China to teach the Chinese how to paint. They invited him to come because they were in somewhat of a quandary of what to do with their work. They didn't want to go back to classical Confucian painting. The folk art could only go so far. And so they said, well, Soviet Socialist Realism. And Maximov is the artist who went to Kaffa in Beijing and taught Chinese that style. Semyon Chuikov from Kyrgyzstan, a leading academician. They're not here because they're bad paintings. They're actually quite good paintings. And that particularly, Kozhov's a great artist. And that's a funny artist. So as the Soviet Union had crumbled, China had opened up in the 80s, and we'd been we had been researching through the 80s what had been going on in China, and it was a far cry from this kind of thing. And it resulted in 1993. It couldn't happen earlier because of the events of June the 4th in 1989, after which there was a boycott by Europe on China. And this was eventually lifted in 1993. And we're able to do two exhibitions, Silent Energy, New Art from China, and China Avant-Garde. And you'll be familiar with all these works, I know. It's the China Avant-Garde exhibition in 1989 in Beijing. It's the one in Oxford. And these works were in the show. The famous, iconic works. But no one knew anything about them in Western Europe, let alone Great Britain. The first show we worked with the Haus der Kultur in the Welt in Berlin. And then this is the work of Site Pacific, the exhibition of Site Pacific work, which we made at that time. Now, just to really bring this circle round, and I'm going to close my talk here, is an exhibition that I made in 1995, which actually was 25 years of work for me, not 20 years of work, but 25 years of work for me. Because I was one of the curators in this Council of Europe exhibition called Art and Power, Europe Under the Dictators, responsible for Germany and Russia, the Soviet Union. And I was able to, in a way, not finish, but at least put a cap on what I'd started in 1970 in Durham. Looking at the mechanism of art and power, and actually bringing together the degenerate work with the official work. This is Arno Breker, Prometheus, 1937. It was designed to stand outside Hitler's Reichskanzlei, this fake classicism, horrible stuff, actually, but also seductive in its way. And the way how he showed it in the Hayward Gallery was to light it properly, and also to light it with sorry, I just try and get to there, showing the Arno Breker with the Vera Muchina, who I actually think is a much better sculptor, but to show them and light them in a way that could actually show people that these things were perhaps seductive, that there was an attraction in this art. It wasn't only horrible. But not to try and do a whitewash job on that work, but to show it within the context of artists who worked by themselves, for themselves, not with any ideology other than trying to make as good art as they could under extremely difficult circumstances. And it was super difficult then, but I believe it's difficult at any time for any artist who values their independence and values their talent. So, dear Adolf, Willy Baumeister. He went along to the official exhibition of German art in 1941 and saw this work by Arno Breker. You see, he did a graffiti on it. Baumeister was a leading degenerate artist at the time, finding it very, very hard. They moved a housing of SS men right next to him where his studio was. And he did that. And no one had even knew that until we actually went and found it and pulled it out. And it was difficult to resist in Hitler's Germany. Yet this is a form of resistance. And resistance of many different forms is very important. And they have to be shown. That's Baumeister, as he's known, as an artist before the war. Or Oskar Kokoschka in London at the time, showing the kind of weakness of the Western powers against Hitler. Or the official art of Stalin. Or Kazimir Malevich, a bearded peasant from 1932, a work made at the height of the famine in Ukraine and southern Russia, when 6 million peasants died or were forced off their land, and not a word of it was mentioned in the press. But in art it was. And Malevich and some other artists at that time, they paint peasants. They paint peasants alone, with crosses behind them, and they have no faces. So they're peasants who no longer exist. Or El Duce in Italy at that time, this way how futurism got together with the fascist state and created its own particular hybrid. Or Giacomo Mansu, being a resistance to that, actually made his images of the crucifixion in 1939, and the soldier who's looking at Christ hanging from what looks like a torture frame, of course wearing a Nazi Italian fascist helmet. That's it. So, thank you very much. I've been talking for just an hour, and if there are any questions, I'll be very happy to take it on. Actually, I'll just go on for just a couple more slides, because as we're talking about the Second World War and oppression, this is a good point to start, because there's Heri Dono, an artist from Indonesia, which was being shown at the same time, was working on at the same time as Art and Power. And had seen his work in the first Asia Pacific Triennale in Brisbane in 1991. And he's someone who was very much involved with the fabric of politics and society in Indonesia. And he made a wayang performance called the Drunkenness of Semar, which is a trickster figure, so the kind of symbolism of politics everywhere going on. But then he did a large installation which had to do with the resistance in Indonesia, and the way how the Indonesian army were leaving landmines all around in the jungle, and people were losing limbs through this. And so this is called Blooming in Arms, and that's the sketch that he made for it, and that's the installation that he made from it. Now, Heri was lucky enough to get a review in the Times for this, and it talked about his ideas and shown to it, but he was also extremely unlucky, because he then got a letter, as indeed I got a letter from the Indonesian embassy, saying that everything stated about Indonesia and its culture was wrong, and that the catalogue should be immediately withdrawn. Now, this is very difficult. And he was out of the country, we got in touch with him, and of course he said, please withdraw it. I don't know if you've seen Oppenheimer's film about Indonesia, about the death squads working in Indonesia in the 60s and 70s. But it was a very cruel and disgusting situation. So, having moved in the safe confines of history with World War II, all of a sudden you're in a situation, or he was as a living artist in a situation, where his family could be threatened. we had a dilemma because, of course, we don't like to be threatened by foreign governments and told to withdraw something. And a compromise was found whereby I'd been out and my assistant had sent a letter to the embassy saying, well, we're terribly sorry, but the exhibition closed yesterday and we, of course, withdraw all of the catalogues from sale. And our director will write to you in due course. But anyway, she had what she needed, the lady from the Indonesian embassy, and she said, I wrote back, I'm delighted these have been withdrawn from sale, so she could say mission accomplished. He was absolutely mortified and very worried about the situation, and we said, well, we support you with this, and it will remain off sale, and officially off sale anyway, and we eventually heard from him 4 years later when the Indonesian government fell that it could now be sold again. But dangerous stuff art deals with strong feelings and real things and lives and deaths. That's why I'm interested in it. Can't avoid it. Thank you. Yeah, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to.
I'm curious about your book, Art in Trousers. What that title?
About? Well, it's a book about tradition and modernity in contemporary Asian art. And so it's a whole series of essays I've written about different artists and different groups of artists in different parts of Asia. I mean, that is the content of the book. But the metaphor of trousers, or history of the trouser, both the social migratory history of the trouser and the political history of the trouser, is perfect to describe how art moves through history itself and how influences move from history. I mean, just to say, the oldest existing pair of trousers, of course, come from China. And they were worn 4,500 years ago in what is Xinjiang province. But the people who were wearing them were 6'6" tall with blonde eye, blue hair, and were certainly not Chinese. So that's the first conundrum that we have there. Now, the Chinese, once a little bit further on in history, hated trousers. They thought trousers were worn by barbarians, and they were. Barbarians were people on the other side of the Chinese wall, and they absolutely refused to wear them. They wore tunics, other clothes. So trousers were the clothing of barbarians, except they were rather useful if you were riding horses. And you first see the first Chinese trousers, I think, appear in the warriors of the Jin Emperor, the famous terracotta warriors. If you look at the cavalry, they are wearing some kind of trouser. So looking how things move from one place to another and how trousers can be thought to be barbaric, or they may thought to be elite in some other cases, and the ones worn 5,000 years ago by the migrants from what we guess is either northern Greece or Central Europe, were very highly decorated, very carefully woven with very bright colors. And we know that because they were kept in the Taklamakan desert, which is a salt desert, and it preserved them. So trousers are a metaphor. They're a metaphor for tradition, a metaphor for modernity. For many people, first experienced trousers when colonial troops came marching because they were wearing them as their uniforms, whereas they weren't. They were wearing something else. And who's wearing the trousers? There's also a gender element here. And the history of trousers, women wearing trousers or not, is also very fascinating. And also what that represents in terms of gender equality or lack of equality. So it features colonialism, patriarchy, and migration, the three big themes in the book, which are all told through the history of trousers, but also told through the individual histories of artists and areas, whether it's Tibet or Central Asia or Japan, or there are general essays on those different areas, or individual Chinese artists or Indonesian artists. That's it. Yes?
The one thing that you haven't talked too much about this afternoon
your experience in Japan. I think this is, a very interesting subject to sort of. It sounds like you're touching on it in your book.
Yeah, sure.
And about your experience setting up the Mori and starting the Mori and your 5 years in Japan. Maybe you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, the Japanese made a big deal that I was the first non-Japanese director of an art museum, rather in the same way the Swedes did when I went to Sweden, the first non-Swedish. And it really exercised some people, both in Sweden and Japan, that I was not Swedish or not Japanese, but it didn't really bother me because I just got on and did what I do anyway. And that is, when we're talking about qualities, I think it is very much an individual thing of deciding what it is you want to do and what you like and what you think's good and not good and how and why, all those things. And then you get on and do it. And of course, you can explain on a case-by-case basis why you think something's good. But there's no formula for goodness. I can't give anyone a formula for it. Because art is in the constant process of becoming. So are artists themselves. The whole field of what art can and cannot do is an open discussion. We're all talking about post-internet art now. Most of it bores me rigid, but maybe that's my problem rather than the problem of the art. Happiness. Well, the first exhibition in Sweden had been called Wounds, between democracy and redemption in contemporary art. And that was really about ideas of art being the Freudian idea of art being made out of some trauma or suffering. I'm not saying I necessarily believe it, but there is a theory that art does come out of that, out of dislocation, and often expresses dislocation. And in Japan, there was happiness, and opening a very large space in a 14-hectare new development. I thought we need an exhibition that no one can disagree with. And happiness, no one's going to disagree with happiness. But so that got through, fine. But then when we split up happiness into 4 different ideas, 4 different continents, so it was a journey through a world of happiness. So the first continent was Arcadia. So that could be the idea that things were so much better once than they are now. Or utopia, that things will be so much better in the future than they are now. So that opened this field up for a whole lot of weird stuff about ideology, politics, social development, and also images. Like we had the sketch for Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe and Picasso's version of that, or 6-panel screens from Japan, Muromachi, Japan, the 4 elegant pastimes, which too are Arcadian. So second section was called Nirvana, which is about metaphysics, metaphysical development in art, the idea of spirituality in art. The third section was Desire, which is about appetite and consumption and sex. And the last section was called Harmony. And that was based on the idea that happiness of others, the greatest happiness that can be found is actually in the happiness of others. So not cheesy, but actually very down to earth. And the works that we chose within that were systems, about systems and cosmologies in different ways by contemporary artists. And that show went all the way back to 5th century China.
First of all, thank you. It was such a fascinating talk and presentation, and very rare in Hong Kong to have such privilege. So welcome.
Thank you.
You said you are bored by the post-internet era. I'm curious to know, how do you think the art history would look at this decade we're living in, the digital decade, knowledgeable, you can reach and search everything much easier than the past century, which makes accessibility more fascinating. You can reach more, but overflow of artworks, artists, good, bad, and ugly, would be judged differently, I think, in the future.
Yes. It's an open question, I think. I'm not avoiding your question. But I think what happens to curators that more and more, particularly when there's been a big kind of personality cult developed around curators, is that people are more interested in celebrity than actually in their knowledge about art, and that they're not studying, they're not looking around elsewhere, they're going with the flow. And of course, if the flow's on the internet, it's even easier and you can pick and pop. And it sort of becomes like picking chocolates out of a particularly rich selection of different goodies. And it shows, it really shows. And there's a lack of depth and conviction and position, I think, in many curators' work, not all. And this is, for me, it's a problem. And I think it's a problem if that is transmitted to the museum, because museums, they may have good collections. But what makes a public museum different from, say, a private museum or just a very good collector? I mean, they've probably got less money to spend on contemporary art. But what they have, I mean, is firstly, they should be disinterested, not feeling they have to follow the latest trend or whatever. They follow and buy because they really believe in the artist and the work, the particular work, because one buys works, not artists. And be researching in that and ahead of the game. And I think that, I hope what came through a little bit, that if you are ahead of the game and you're looking, you can get things before they're picked up by the market. I mean, people did think I was slightly crazy showing, and deeply uncool showing Indian art in 1981. But I didn't particularly care. I mean, that much. A little bit. But it had to be part of the discussion. And if you don't show it and confront it yourself, even if sometimes you're a bit uneasy with it, you'll never get anywhere, I think. And you'll never know yourself well enough. That's the other thing. Because what I've been showing to you, and I don't know how it came across, is a journey through knowledge and of how one thing leads to another. Because I wasn't born knowing anything about art. And everything that I know now, I've got to learn. And these different channels work in different ways. You said...
They need to sell tickets to get visitors.
Yeah, I mean, they're becoming, saying museums are like shopping malls, they have to sell tickets to get visitors. And they're being increasingly run by their PR departments. I mean, this is certainly true. And that is a great shame. I mean, they're not they're placed to enjoy things, but they're not an entertainment. And if you're dependent on the income, well, if you're doing a Velázquez show and you do a good Velázquez show, you've got a public for that. And you've got an added public because some will come because they actually care about Velázquez, but others will come because they don't know but would like to know. And others will come just because they think they ought to see it. So that's a kind of virtuous circle. The research is very important. And I think that what the public sector have, which the private sector doesn't have, is their disinterestedness. And that, if they choose to use it, is a great power. It's a great power on the market. And my view, I have to say it, I hope it doesn't sound arrogant, is that we made the market in the 70s by not following it, rather than by researching and looking, rather than wanting to be me too. Because if you're working in a gallery, say in Bristol or somewhere like that, I mean, you've got to really know your subject and also know others in your subject and be prepared to travel somehow and get the money to do it. Otherwise, you'll be lost. You'll be depressed and lonely.
last question.
Okay, Mr. Elliott, I would like to bring a topic of self-censorship. You have been curating for, we have listened to you, and there's a breadth of places and regimes and regions that you have visited, researched, and showed. And we're here in Hong Kong, and I'd just like to bring this up. How did you look at self-censorship? How did you avoid self-censorship in perhaps, or how did you ever self-censor yourself? Because being a mature and politically correct person, we want the show to be hugely popular, but we don't want to step on our feet as well. Thank you.
It's a different one, and you're asking someone who's, I'm not at the end of my career. I intend to do a lot of things in the future, but I'm more towards the end of it than at the beginning. So I haven't got a lot to lose or risk by saying my mind. But as I say, I was working through the Thatcher years in Britain, and you were expected to do certain things and not certain things, and I resented feeling that I should behave in a certain way. And just like you become a representative of the Cold War ideology through your exhibition program, which I think that Joachim Eides and Rosenthal and Wieland Schmid did, perhaps unconsciously, in their exhibition of German art. That's just not on. Or maybe you genuinely believe it. You're a member of the team, yes, But there are humans out there too, and those humans, some of them are artists, and some of them may be bloody good artists. That's the thing. And it's not the fact that you live in a lousy communist state, you are automatically a lousy communist person. And anyway, that kind of extreme alterity never gets anyone anywhere. And I think one has to look at the world in a more crystalline way. And actually that you can see the world in a grain of sand. And the good exhibition does that. And the good artist does that. The whole universe, it has that resonance.
Well, thank you, David, so very much. That was really a wonderful talk.
Thank you.